June 323 BCE, Babylon. The most powerful man in the world is dying, and nothing can stop it. For more than a week, fever has been draining him inside the old palace of Nebuchadnezzar, in the city he had chosen as the center of the largest empire ever built by one lifetime of conquest. His generals crowd into the room, men who marched with him across 3 continents, who watched him climb siege walls first, who saw him take an arrow through the chest and keep commanding. According to ancient accounts, one of them finally asked the question that matters more than any battle he ever won: who inherits the kingdom? His answer, as later writers record it, is 2 words, not a name, not a plan: to the strongest. Historians still debate whether this was truly his final statement, since the surviving accounts were written generations later and don't fully agree with each other. But what happens next is not in dispute. Within days, Alexander the Great is dead at 32, and the empire he built, stretching from Greece to Egypt to the edge of India, undefeated in every major battle he ever fought, starts coming apart almost immediately. Not over centuries, not even over 1 generation. Within about 20 years, the men who had helped him build that empire will be at war with each other, and that war will kill his mother, his wife, and both of his heirs. No foreign army did this. No outside power ever beat Alexander's forces on a battlefield. The empire that seemed unstoppable was torn apart from the inside by the very people who had helped conquer it. So the real question isn't how Alexander won. It's how something built that completely could fall apart that fast. And the answer isn't found in the battles. It's found in what he never built at all. To understand that, we have to go back before Alexander, to the kingdom and the system that made him possible. Macedonia, in the mid-4th century BCE, was not yet a great power. It sat on the northern edge of the Greek world, viewed by the wealthier city-states to the south, Athens, Thebes, Sparta, as a rough frontier kingdom, not a serious rival. That changed under Alexander's father, Philip II, who took the throne in 359 BCE and spent the next 2 decades rebuilding Macedonia from the ground up. Philip's most important decision wasn't a battle, it was a redesign of the army itself. He created a professional, standing military, something most Greek city-states didn't have, since they relied on part-time citizen soldiers who returned to farms and workshops between campaigns. Philip's soldiers trained constantly. He armed his infantry with the sarissa, a pike roughly 15 to 18 feet long, far longer than traditional Greek spears, which let his phalanx dominate the front line, while his elite cavalry, the companions, delivered the decisive strike. This wasn't just a stronger army, it was a different kind of army, coordinated, disciplined, and built for sustained campaigning rather than single seasonal battles. That machine won Philip control over Greece. At the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, Macedonian forces crushed a coalition of Athens and Thebes, and Philip followed the victory with something more lasting than conquest. The League of Corinth, an alliance of Greek states placed under Macedonian leadership, built around a shared goal: an invasion of the Persian Empire, the great power to the east that had loomed over Greek politics for over a century. Philip never got to lead that invasion. In 336 BCE, he was assassinated at his own daughter's wedding by a member of his royal bodyguard. The killer's exact motives are still debated by historians, and some ancient sources hint at wider palace intrigue, but no reliable evidence directly proves a larger conspiracy. What is certain is what happened next. Alexander, 20 years old, was proclaimed king almost immediately. He inherited a kingdom, a professional army, and a war already being planned. What he did with it over the next 13 years would reshape the ancient world. But the seeds of the empire's later collapse were already present in this moment, even if no one could see them yet. Alexander inherited a machine built for conquest. He never inherited and never built a machine designed to govern what that conquest produced. Alexander moved fast to secure his throne, eliminating rival claimants and crushing a revolt in the Greek city of Thebes. In 335 BCE, with brutal finality. The city was destroyed, and its surviving population sold into slavery, a calculated message to any other Greek state considering rebellion while he campaigned abroad. In 334 BCE, he crossed into Asia Minor with a combined Macedonian and Greek force, and what followed was one of the fastest, most complete military conquests in recorded history. At the Granicus River, he defeated the regional Persian forces guarding the coast. At Issus, in 333 BCE, he faced the Persian king Darius III directly and routed his much larger army, forcing Darius to flee and leaving his family captured. Alexander then turned south, taking the fortified island city of Tyre after a grueling 7-month siege, and marched into Egypt, where he was welcomed without resistance and founded the city of Alexandria, a settlement that would outlive his empire by well over 1,000 years. Then came Gaugamela in 331 BCE, the battle that effectively ended the Persian Empire. Despite being significantly outnumbered, Alexander's combined infantry and cavalry tactics broke Darius's forces decisively. Babylon, Susa, and the ceremonial capital of Persepolis fell in quick succession. Darius fled eastward and was killed months later, not by Alexander, but by his own satrap, Bessus, who hoped to seize power for himself. It didn't work. Alexander pursued Bessus deep into Central Asia, through what's now Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, spending nearly 3 brutal years fighting an entrenched local resistance, led by a commander named Spidomenes before the region was even loosely under control. By any conventional measure, Alexander had already achieved something almost no one in history ever would. He had conquered the entire Persian Empire, the largest state the world had yet seen, in roughly a decade. But here's the problem that mattered more than any battle. Conquering territory and governing territory are not the same skill, and Alexander was about to discover, or maybe never fully confront, just how different they were. What actually held this empire together was not a shared government. It was Alexander himself. Rather than replacing the entire Persian administrative system, Alexander largely kept it running, retaining many local satraps, regional governors, and layering Macedonian officials over or alongside them. This was practical. Persia had governed a vast, diverse territory for 2 centuries, and its administrative structure already existed. Rebuilding it from scratch would have taken decades Alexander didn't have and didn't seem interested in spending. But this created a structural problem that never got solved. There was no single, unified bureaucracy answering to a central Macedonian state. There was no fixed capital. There was no independent civil service that could function without Alexander's direct authority behind it. The empire ran on personal loyalty to Alexander specifically, rather than institutions that could outlast him. Alexander seemed to sense the fragility of a purely Macedonian ruling class governing a Persian population, and he pursued a deliberate policy of cultural fusion. He adopted elements of Persian royal dress and court ceremony. He encouraged intermarriage between his officers and Persian noble women. He married Roxana, a noblewoman from Bactria, in 327 BCE, partly as a political alliance with the region's local elites. But this policy came at a cost. Many of his Macedonian officers viewed the adoption of Persian customs, particularly proskynesis, a ritual gesture of respect performed before the king, as monarchical excess, a betrayal of the more egalitarian traditions of Macedonian kingship. The tension wasn't abstract, it turned violent. In 328 BCE, during a drunken argument that touched on exactly this issue, Alexander killed one of his own senior commanders and childhood friends, Hyphasis the Black, in a fit of rage he reportedly regretted almost immediately. A year earlier, he had also overseen the execution of Philotas, a top general accused of conspiracy, along with the killing of Philotas's father, Parmenion, one of Philip's most experienced commanders, largely as a precaution against the threat he might pose. What matters here isn't just the violence, it's what the violence reveals. The empire's command structure was becoming something Alexander controlled through fear and personal authority, as much as through formal institutions. That kind of control can move an army with terrifying speed. It cannot easily survive the death of the one person holding it together. By 327 BCE, Alexander pushed further than any Macedonian force ever had into India, defeating the regional king Porus at the brutal Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BCE, a fight remembered for Porus's war elephants and for Alexander's tactical improvisation under extremely difficult conditions. This was, in almost every sense, the peak of his power, and it's exactly here that the hidden weakness in the entire system finally surfaces in the open. At the Hyphasis River, Alexander's army stopped. After 8 years of continuous campaigning, thousands of miles from home, exhausted and worn down by monsoon conditions and years of combat, his soldiers refused to go any further east. This wasn't a mutiny in the sense of open rebellion against his authority. It was something arguably more revealing. The army simply would not march anymore, no matter what Alexander wanted. And Alexander backed down. Think about what that moment actually shows. This was not a democracy. This was not a system with a senate, or a council, or a legal mechanism that could check the king's power. And yet the single most successful conqueror in the ancient world had just been stopped, not by an enemy, but by the will of his own soldiers. His authority, for all its scale, was ultimately personal and conditional, dependent on the army's willingness to keep following him. There was no deeper institutional foundation underneath it. That absence would matter enormously very soon. The return march made things worse. Rather than retracing a safer route, Alexander led part of his force through the Gedrosian Desert in 325 BCE, and the crossing turned into a catastrophe. Ancient sources describe devastating losses among soldiers and the civilians traveling with the army, from heat, thirst, and starvation. The exact numbers are uncertain and likely exaggerated by ancient writers, but the broader pattern is not disputed. This was one of the costliest stretches of the entire campaign, and it happened after the fighting was essentially over. When Alexander finally returned to the Persian heartland, he discovered something almost as troubling as the desert crossing. While he'd been gone for years on the eastern campaigns, several of the satraps and officials he'd left in charge had governed badly, some abusing their power outright. He responded with a purge, executing a number of corrupt officials. It was decisive. It was also proof of a deeper flaw. The empire could not reliably govern itself in his absence. Distance from Alexander meant distance from effective oversight. Then, in 324 BCE, at the city of Opis, came a second and far more direct confrontation with his own army. Alexander announced he would send aging and wounded Macedonian veterans home, while continuing to integrate Persian soldiers into the military. His troops, already uneasy about years of cultural fusion policy, interpreted this as being replaced. The standoff grew tense enough that Alexander reportedly had a group of ringleaders executed on the spot, before eventually reconciling with the wider army through a mass banquet meant to symbolize unity between Macedonians and Persians. Around the same period, he staged mass weddings at Susa, marrying dozens of his officers to Persian noblewomen in a single ceremony, a striking, almost theatrical attempt to physically fuse the two ruling classes into one. It's one of the clearest signs that Alexander understood, on some level, that his empire needed something beyond conquest to survive. The problem is that a policy of intermarriage, imposed from the top in a single ceremony, is not the same thing as building durable institutions. It solved nothing about who would actually run the empire once Alexander was gone. And then, in 324 BCE, his closest companion, Hephaestion, died suddenly, likely from illness. Alexander's grief, by every ancient account, was extreme and prolonged. Some historians have speculated that his own health and judgment declined in the months that followed, though this connection is difficult to prove with certainty from the sources available. What's clear is that Alexander, at this point, still had no named heir, no chosen successor, and no clear plan for what would happen to the empire if something happened to him. Something did. In June of 323 BCE, after a sudden illness, lasting less than 2 weeks, Alexander died in Babylon. His wife Roxana was pregnant, but the child, the boy who would become Alexander IV, had not yet been born. His only other potential heir was his half-brother, Philip III Aridaeus, who ancient sources describe as having some kind of cognitive impairment that made him unsuited to actually rule, even as a figurehead. This is the moment everything had been building toward, whether anyone recognized it at the time or not. Alexander had spent 13 years assembling the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. He had spent almost none of that time building a system that could survive without him personally at the center of it. His generals gathered in Babylon to figure out what came next, in a settlement historians call the Partition of Babylon. The compromise they reached was, in hindsight, less a solution than a fiction. Philip III and the yet unborn Alexander IV would be named joint kings, with real power held by regents and generals acting in their name. The empire's territories were carved up among Alexander's most powerful commanders. Ptolemy took Egypt, Antigonus took territory in Asia Minor, Lysimachus took Thrace, and other generals divided the remaining satrapies, each with their own army, their own ambitions, and increasingly, their own agenda. On paper, the empire was still one entity, loyal to two symbolic kings. In practice, it was already several independent power bases, waiting for an excuse to fight. The excuse didn't take long to arrive. The Wars of the Successors, often called the Wars of the Diadochi, stretched across roughly 4 decades, and they were not a single conflict, but a rolling series of betrayals, alliances, and battles between former comrades. Perdiccas, the regent who initially held the most authority, was assassinated by his own officers in 321 BCE after a failed invasion of Egypt. From there, the fighting only intensified. The royal family itself became a target rather than a source of stability. Philip III and his wife were executed in 317 BCE on the orders of Alexander's own formidable mother, Olympias, who was herself killed the following year during a violent power struggle with the general Cassander. Roxana and the young Alexander IV, the last legitimate heir to the entire empire, were murdered around 309 BCE, also on Cassander's orders, ending the royal bloodline entirely. This is worth pausing on, because it's the clearest proof of everything this system lacked. An empire that size, built on that much conquest, could not protect a single child who represented its own legal legitimacy. Once that bloodline was gone, the remaining generals stopped even pretending. Between 306 and 304 BCE, several of them formally declared themselves kings in their own right, abandoning any remaining fiction of a unified Macedonian throne. One general, Antigonus Monophthalmus, the one-eyed, came closer than anyone to reversing the fragmentation, building enough territory and military strength that the other successors saw him as an existential threat to their own survival. They formed a coalition against him, and in 301 BCE, at the Battle of Issus in Anatolia, Antigonus was defeated and killed. It was the last realistic chance the empire had of being pulled back together under a single ruler. After Issus, that possibility was gone for good. What emerged from the wreckage over the following years was a new political map. The Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire stretching across much of the former Persian heartland, and the Antigonid dynasty eventually regaining control of Macedonia itself. 3 major successor states, and several smaller ones, replacing what had briefly been a single empire spanning 3 continents. Here's what's easy to miss in all of this. Alexander's conquest didn't disappear. Greek language, Greek art, Greek administrative and military ideas spread and blended with local cultures across the Near East and into Central Asia for the next 3 centuries, a period historians call the Hellenistic era. Alexandria, the city he founded almost as an afterthought during the Egyptian campaign, became one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world. Generations later, Roman generals, including Julius Caesar, reportedly measured their own ambitions against Alexander's legacy. So the legacy was enormous. The empire, as a single political structure, was not, And that gap between the two is the real story here. Alexander built the most effective conquering machine the ancient world had ever seen. A machine of loyalty, speed, tactical brilliance, and sheer relentless momentum. What he never built was a system capable of governing what that machine produced once the conquering stopped. No institutionalized succession. No independent bureaucracy that didn't depend on his personal presence. No mechanism for transferring authority that didn't ultimately come down to which general commanded the most loyal soldiers. The strength of the system was Alexander himself, and that strength was also, in the end, its single greatest weakness. The moment he was gone, there was nothing left holding the different pieces together except the ambitions of the men who had helped him conquer it. An ambition, without a shared institution to contain it, doesn't build empires. It tears them apart. That's really the lesson underneath this entire story. Conquest and governance are two different problems, and solving one brilliantly doesn't guarantee you've solved the other at all. Thank you for watching. If you found this breakdown of how empires actually rise and fall useful, consider subscribing for more deep dives like this one. And I'd love to know what you think. Was this collapse inevitable the moment Alexander refused to name an heir? Or is there a point earlier in the story where one different decision could have kept the empire together?